It was such a thing as I had never seen before, and would never see again. Wild, wonderful, terrible. But terror is not what I felt. I loved the mountains too well for that. I loved Everest too well for that. At that great moment for which I had waited all my life, I did not see my mountain as a lifeless thing of rock and ice, but warm, friendly, and living. Such were the words of Tenzing Norgay when he and his climbing partner Edmund Hillary became the first people to verifiably summit the tallest mountain on Earth. As a historian, I can say that history reaches new heights on every day of the calendar, but rarely so, literally so. But despite setting such a high bar, Tenzing and Hillary were not the only people to have taken important steps on this day in history. May 29th figures prominently in the history of great empires and princes. On May 29th, 1233, the Jin dynasty capital of Kaifeng fell to the Mongols after a 13-month siege that had starved the population. As many as 1 million people may have died as a result of the siege. The fall of the Jin capital did not end the 23-year Mongol-Jin War, as the Jin emperor had escaped, but the 119-year-old dynasty was crippled and would fall before the end of the year. The siege is important in the history of military technology, as the city's defenders used many gunpowder weapons never before encountered by the Mongols, including fire lances and explosives propelled by trebuchets. The Mongols would later adopt the use of these weapons. The conquest was at least partially responsible for a sizable population drop in northern China, and many historians argue that the Mongols were responsible for millions of deaths. Furthermore, several historians have hypothesized that the Mongol conquests of the 13th century played a central role in carrying the Yersinia pestis bacteria to Europe, spreading the Black Death, the deadliest pandemic in history. On May 29, 1328, France crowned Philip, the paternal cousin of the deceased King Charles IV, King of France. Philip VI was the first French king of the House of Valois, which would remain the royal house of France for more than 2.5 centuries. By passing over Charles IV's closest male relative, Edward III of England, Philip's coronation precipitated the 100 Years' War. Nearly 500 years later, on May 29, 1815, Charles X was crowned King of France. Charles had been heir apparent following the defeat of Napoleon and the Bourbon Restoration, and became king after the death of his older brother, Louis XVIII. Charles ruled in a time of chaos in France and was forced to abdicate after the Second French Revolution in 1830. While 2 more men would carry on the Bourbon dynasty as King of the French, neither opted for a coronation ceremony in a time when the people were disillusioned with the monarchy. Thus, the coronation of Charles X was the last coronation of a French monarch. The Roman Empire stood for nearly 1,500 years, defining the history of Europe into Asia Minor. On May 29, 1453, the empire saw what is generally considered to be its final end, when Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire and last vestige of Rome, was captured by the forces of 21-year-old Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, Mehmed II, the Conqueror. The historical importance of the event is difficult to overstate. To historians, it represents not just the final fall of Rome, but the end of the Middle Ages and the beginning of the early modern period. It represented the ascendance of gunpowder on the battlefield. The fallen city became the new capital of a powerful and rising empire. To Europe at the time, it represented disaster and a new threat to all of Christendom. But the migration of scholars from the fallen city also dramatically transformed European understanding, thought, and scientific study. The fall of Constantinople simply represents one of the most monumental events in the history of both the Christian and Muslim worlds. More than 3.5 centuries later, the Ottoman Empire was in decline, nearly bankrupt, and facing challenges between forces of tradition and reform. On May 29, 1807, Mustafa IV overthrew his cousin, Selim III, in a coup d'etat to become the Ottoman Sultan. At issue was the Janissary Corps, once an elite fighting force that had helped Mehmed II conquer Constantinople, but had over time become corrupt. Selim's efforts to reform the army and rein in the Janissary power alienated powerful forces in the empire, who put their support behind his cousin in the 1807 coup. To secure his throne, Mustafa then had Selim murdered. Mustafa's reign was brief, however. He himself was deposed by his half-brother Mehmed II in July of 1808. While Mustafa's brief reign represented the failure of reform efforts intended to modernize the empire under Selim, Muhammad, however, succeeded, breaking the power of the Janissary Corps and directing a resurgence that had him compared to Peter the Great of Russia. It was an advance in naval warfare that helped preserve the Korean Joseon dynasty. The May 29, 1592 Battle of Sachun occurred during the Imjin War, a Japanese invasion of Korea. In the naval battle, the Japanese fleet was lured into leaving a protected harbor and engaged in a battle in the open sea, where a fierce Korean attack devastated the Japanese warships, sinking all 13 Japanese ships that had engaged in the battle. The battle is important as the first time that the Koreans deployed a turtle ship, large, heavily, possibly iron-armored vessels. The turtle ships played a significant role in defeating Japanese invasions of Korea in the 16th century. The Korean admiral Yi Sun-sin was wounded by a Japanese arquebus in what might have been a devastating blow, but the wound turned out to be minor. The British Isles also faced the challenges of a modernizing world in the 17th century during the English Civil War, actually a series of wars fought over fundamental issues of royal power and religious questions of the Reformation. After a series of defeats against the New Model Army of Parliament, King Charles I had been taken captive, and after an attempt to flee was imprisoned at Carlsbrook Castle on the Isle of Wight. On May 29, 1647, the king attempted to escape the castle, having had a hacksaw smuggled in to remove a window bar. The attempt was discovered and foiled. It would be his last attempt to escape before his execution in 1649. May 29, 1647 also happened to be the 17th birthday of his son, also named Charles, born in 1630. After Charles I's execution and the establishment of the Commonwealth, tensions between Parliament and the army rose and became acute after the death of Oliver Cromwell. After an 11-year interregnum, the Commonwealth collapsed and Charles II was called back to restore the monarchy. He entered London to public acclaim on May 29, 1660, his 30th birthday. In 1864, conservative monarchists sought to oppose liberal forces and restore monarchy to Mexico. Debt repayments following the Mexican Civil War were used as a pretense for foreign intervention, particularly France under Napoleon III, and the younger brother of Emperor Franz Joseph of Austria, Grand Duke Maximilian, was recruited to lead a new monarchy supported by conservatives. Maximilian officially accepted the crown as Emperor of the Second Mexican Empire on April 10, 1864, following a largely discredited referendum. But he and his wife Charlotte did not arrive in Mexico at Veracruz until May 29th. Maximilian's stay would not end well. Republican forces continued to oppose his rule. The end of the U.S. Civil War led to U.S. support for his Republican opposition, and France, seeing victory as impossible, withdrew. Without French support, Maximilian's forces were defeated. He was captured and executed on June 19, 1867. Near the end of the next century, another empire was in decline. On May 29, 1990, Boris Yeltsin was elected chairman of the Supreme Soviet of the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic. He would be the last chairman of Soviet Russia. He presided over the dissolution of the Soviet Union and became the first president of the Russian Federation. Despite his achievements, he was deeply unpopular by the time he left office, and his legacy is controversial. May 29, 1914 would claim yet another empress. The ocean liner RMS Empress of Ireland, launched in 1906 and operated by the Canadian Pacific Steamship Company, 570 feet long, had been built following the lessons of the Titanic disaster, including not just watertight compartments but also ample lifeboats for all aboard. But when the ship collided with the Norwegian collier SS Storstad at 1:56 a.m. in heavy fog off Pointe-au-Père, Quebec, the damage was so great that there was no time to close the watertight doors, nor for most aboard, many of whom were asleep when the collision occurred, to reach the lifeboats. On the port side, the list was so bad that boats couldn't be lowered at all. The ship sank in less than 14 minutes, with hundreds of passengers and crew thrown into frigid water. 1,012 people were killed. 465 survived. May 29th represents several milestones in the history of the growing United States. On May 29th, 1765, Virginia House of Burgesses delegate Patrick Henry gave a speech denouncing the new British tax called the Stamp Act. His incendiary oration said, "Caesar had his Brutus, Charles I his Cromwell, and George III may profit by their example." His comments prompted another delegate to shout the word treason, to which Henry responded, If this be treason, make the most of it. Henry avoided a charge of treason and convinced the House of Burgesses to pass 5 resolutions denouncing the British Act. Similar resolutions were passed in other colonies as they slid towards rebellion. 25 years later, the formation of the new United States was completed when the legislature of Rhode Island became the last of the original 13 colonies to ratify the United States Constitution by a vote of 34 to 32. Rhode Island had resisted ratification for a number of reasons, fearing both federal authority and the state's Quaker population opposing the elements of the Constitution that legitimized slavery. Rhode Island also had enjoyed relative authority under the Articles of Confederation, which required that all 13 states ratify amendments, which offered a sort of veto power that Rhode Island had used to their advantage. Their failure to ratify had caused consternation among the other colonies, who had started calling the state Rogue Island. The state legislature finally acquiesced to ratify the Constitution when faced with the threat of an embargo by Congress. Rhode Island has continued its independent streak, refusing or only belatedly voting to ratify the 16th, 17th, and 18th Amendments. 68 years later, in 1848, the nation expanded again on May 29th, when the 30th state, the state of Wisconsin, was officially admitted to the Union. Wisconsin was the last U.S. state to be admitted that was entirely east of the Mississippi River, and thus the last in the territory specified in the 1783 Treaty of Paris that ended the American Revolutionary War. There are other ways to change the world than empires and nations, and there are other kinds of empires, though. On May 29, 1854, London Paddington Station, generally referred to by Londoners as simply Paddington, designed by the groundbreaking civil engineer Isambard Kingdom Brunel as the official London terminus of services for the Great Western Railway, was officially opened. Much of the 1854 construction remains today in the mainline station. Paddington is, according to the Office of Rail and Road Services, the second busiest station in the United Kingdom. On May 29, 1886, John Smith Pemberton advertised his new drink product in the Atlanta Journal for the first time. It was the very first advertisement for his invention, Coca-Cola. Pemberton, a Confederate Civil War veteran who suffered from chronic pain due to a war wound, originally invented the drink as a wine coca product. And that is a drink that mixed cocaine in wine as a tonic to treat pain, an alternative to morphine. But in 1886, Pemberton altered his formula to become a carbonated fountain drink due to prohibition legislation passed in Fulton County, Georgia. The first advertisement for the newly named Coca-Cola called the drink delicious, refreshing, exhilarating, invigorating. Today, the Coca-Cola Company estimates that they serve around 1.9 billion servings of Coca-Cola every day. On May 29, 1922, professional baseball in America got a boost from the United States Supreme Court in the case Federal Baseball Club versus National League. An owner from the failed Federal League of Baseball Clubs sued the National League and the American League for conspiring to monopolize baseball by destroying the Federal League. In a unanimous decision, the court ruled that baseball game exhibitions are state affairs and thus not interstate commerce, and thus making them not subject to the Sherman Antitrust Act. Baseball is the only professional sport that has been granted such an exemption. On May 29, 1944, Bing Crosby recorded a song written by Irving Berlin for the movie White Christmas, which premiered in 1942. The single was recorded at the Los Angeles studio Radio Recorders with the John Scott Trotter Orchestra and the Ken Darby Singers. Bing Crosby's recording of White Christmas is the world's best-selling single in terms of physical media, with over 50 million physical copies sold. These are just a few of the events that have changed the world on May 29th, a date on which mighty empires have risen and fallen, and on which humanity reached its highest peak. The cliché is that mountain climbers climb mountains because they're there, but Sir Edmund Hillary gave possibly another explanation in the title of his 1975 autobiography. Nothing venture, nothing win. How could we have history if there weren't people out there who were willing to venture? But why do I love history? Because it's there. So much history. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support the History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from the History Guy on Cameo.